Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Sample, and I will be one of your speakers and moderators for today's session on human rights and peace building. Uh, sorry, business and human rights. And we will be discussing some of the particular unique relationships that happen between the business and human rights community and how we can build and improve some of the relationships that we have there. Joining us today, we have four incredible speakers who will be bringing in their different backgrounds to talk about different aspects of that business and human rights relationship. So the way we're going to structure this session, we recognize that it is the last session of the day, and it is Friday. So what we want to do is make this as interactive as possible so that you don't have to listen to the five of us drone on, but we can all still learn something and learn from each other. So we very much encourage you to utilize the chat function, and I'm not entirely sure if it's possible, but if you want to unmute and join the discussion when we are ready for that, we'll definitely invite you to do so. But yes, your best option is probably the chat feature. And we're going to start off with some quick introductions, who you are, where you're working, and what this, this human rights and business relationship means to you in your work. And then we'll go ahead and start off the roundtable discussion. I've got a few questions. I'm sure the speakers have questions for each other, and I would be thrilled to have questions coming in from the audience after our quick introductions. So without further ado, let's start with Doug.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I am a special advisor on business issues with the Fund for Peace, but perhaps the reason I'm here, though, more is my background. I used to be an academic, and I was looking at the role of the private sector in conflict, post-conflict stability operations. And in looking at that, I saw there was a need for an association, essentially, to ensure that companies that operate in conflict, post-conflict environments follow guidelines and codes of conduct. So in 2001, I founded IPOA at the time, International Peace Operations Association. Eventually, that would become International Stability Operations Association. But it's a trade association of companies that work in conflict, post-conflict, and disaster relief. The goal was to get more private sector support for international peacekeeping missions. Back in 2000, one of the big issues was that the West had effectively abrogated its responsibility to international peacekeeping missions. So they were largely abandoned to developing countries to run, and with predictable results, as militaries from weak states are not particularly good at peacekeeping operations. Sierra Leone was classic. I did a couple of research trips there. And while I was there, I actually got together with NGOs and human rights specialists and academics. And we put together what became a code of conduct, basically a 2-page code of conduct on how companies should and should not operate in conflict, post-conflict environments. And my idea was to take this document that had been developed by these NGOs and human rights people to the companies that operate in the conflict areas. This included security and aviation companies and various others, logistics, and get their feedback and then come up with some sort of compromise document. But that didn't happen because I took this code of conduct to the companies, including the security companies, and they all said, look, this is fine. Any company that's professional would be following these guidelines anyway. So it was very easy. So when we founded the association, we used this code of conduct, and every company to this day that joins the association has to agree to abide by the code of conduct. It was done with self-regulation, so we had our own committee that would handle complaints. But since then, a lot has happened. There is something called the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers, based in Geneva, which now works with the private security companies. But the association is actually made up of NGOs, government, and also the industry. And so it's, I think, a much more effective way of holding companies accountable for problems. But in the meantime, there's been a number of lessons learned, I think, over the past 20 years that we will have to pay attention to today. And I think one of them is that security for any any situation like this, the security is 90% of the problem, but only 10% of the solution. So even if you have effective peacekeeping that stops the fighting, other things have to happen. You have to have development. The NGOs have to come in and start doing the peace building, the healthcare, and so on. Security for these events or for these situations can be public or it can be private. Now, I would argue private's a better option. It's less corrupt, cheaper, and more local and more accountable. But any kind of security that you can provide that stops the violence then can create opportunities for long-term peace. For anybody from the other side of the private sector, if you want a long-term solution somewhere, you have to have business and jobs and so on. And if somebody builds a hot dog stand, say in Syria, if they know that hot dog stand is going to be there in 10 years, they're going to invest in it. If they don't know what's going to happen, then you're just not going to have business getting involved. I think these days, international companies are certainly far more aware of their impact on human rights and their influence that they have on conflicts. And I think what we need to look at is more the local and regional companies, which maybe don't pay attention to these things. And one other thing that came out of the past 20 years, and that's the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But I think that was essentially the extractive companies coming together with the NGOs and coming up with basically ideas that everybody can agree to. And I think for the companies that are part of it or that follow the voluntary principles, they've learned they save a lot of money and a lot of angst and a lot of damage to their brand by simply following the guidelines. And I think with all the companies, I've worked with a lot of companies that work with the voluntary principles. They're all very happy with them. They all do their best to follow them. There are what we call bottom feeders that try and get around that, and we can talk about addressing that. But I think it's pretty mainstream now, and I think that's a huge development. So that's it for me. Have I stayed under my 5 minutes?
You're great, Doug. Thank you so much. We'll move on to Jenny Vaughn. If you want to go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Vaughn. I direct the Human Rights Portfolio and Team at BSR. That stands for Business for Social Responsibility. And for those of you who don't know us, we operate a little bit like a nonprofit consulting firm. We aim to work with business to build a just and sustainable world. And to do this, work with companies on a range of issues that fall under what might have previously been called CSR, corporate social responsibility, but what is these days much more likely to be termed sustainability. And we work on human rights issues, climate, diversity and inclusion, a range of other things. We work with these companies by providing insights and advisory services, so kind of like consulting projects, and facilitate collaboration as well. I'm here in part today, though, because I come from a peacebuilding background. So I've been at PSR for about 2.5 years now, but was previously with Mercy Corps for about 10 years, working in a range of field-based and HQ-based roles and focused on peace, conflict, and governance issues. So have really come to the work that I do with companies at BSR from the perspective that the private sector, first of all, is a really critical actor in shaping some of the underlying dynamics that drive conflict. And that if we want to address those underlying drivers of conflict, we really need to harness the private sector in order to act in ways that will be less likely to exacerbate some of those drivers, and ideally is, of course, acting to counter some of those drivers. So really happy to join the conversation today and hope to see some good questions from you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. And we will pass along to our second Jennifer, Jennifer Easterday.
Hi. Yes, nice to meet those of you who I don't already know. I'm Jennifer Easterday. I'm the Executive Director of Just Peace Labs, and I came to this panel much as a lot of my work goes, which is in a very roundabout but fascinating way. So my background is in international law and transitional justice, and I've done doctoral research on the legal frameworks that apply during the post-conflict setting. And so that's really brought me into this space of understanding all of the different players and all of the complexities at play when we're looking at transitioning from conflict and building peace. What Just Peace Labs does is we take a really interesting perspective of working together with companies, specifically technology companies, to understand the role of technology in conflict, but then also to help technology companies understand how they can build conflict sensitivity into their business processes, into their product development, and then also align that with their human rights and sustainability goals. So I'm super excited to be on the panel with all of you, and excited for the rest of the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. And we will introduce Lucy Williams. She is taking the place of her colleague Christine today on our panel. And as you can see, she is a little bit fuzzy because she is in the DRC, and she will be telling us a little bit more about how some of these kind of 10,000 foot ideas play out on the ground. Lucy?
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. This is a very exciting panel for us to be on as International Alert. So I'm Lucy. I'm our Director of Programs for our DRC program, and I'm based in Bukavu in Eastern DRC. We, as International Alert, we're a peacebuilding organization. We've been working in Eastern DRC for about 15 years. Mostly in North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri provinces. And really, for us, I mean, doing business for peace kind of work is one of our main strategies, actually, as an organization globally. And is something that we've recently started to develop a lot more here in DRC. As many of you will know, DRC is still a very live conflict context. We do have many different kinds of actors here. But slowly there are movements now, and certainly businesses is one of those important actors. But there are movements now within the East as certain processes are really taking place. So the UN MONUSCO mission, the UN peacekeeping mission, is slowly transitioning into more of a political mission, as we understand it. And this is soliciting a lot of debate about what that's going to mean for peace building and stabilization in Eastern DRC when such a big actor transitions in its role. And it's also come at the time when the government of DRC is also launching a new DDR strategy. And certainly as part of that, it is looking to private sector to play a role, mostly in job creation. So we feel it's a very interesting time to be having this kind of a discussion around the role of business in peace building and the relationships between business actors and other peace actors. We as International Alert have worked with businesses at different kinds of levels. So we work a lot with small and medium-sized enterprises, which is very interesting because they are local, embedded in the community, have a lot of social capital, and that means that their interests in engaging in peace building are quite different, I would say, to those of larger multinationals. And they're also easily held to account. So that's very interesting. And there we're mostly looking at regional cross-border trade, which is also a very particular dynamic here in the East. Many of the conflicts in Eastern DRC have a regional perspective or angle to them. So working on regional business, which is a win-win for all sides concerned, is also a way of bringing communities together from across the region. Finally, we do also work with larger companies. So about 2 years ago, we started a new project which is in the mining sector, and that's very different. And we're working at really looking more at artisanal mining, but the relationship between artisanal miners and some very large mining companies, which are also present here in the East. So looking at issues of how can you build that long-term vision and commitment that you're looking for from business actors, so that they invest in a responsible and conflict-sensitive way. So that's a little bit what we do at the moment.
Great. Thanks so much, Lucy. And just a little bit about me. I am a programs director at the Fund for Peace, and part of that job is managing the Human Rights and Business Roundtable with Doug, as well as some of our interactions with the VPIs, which we can definitely get into. And so in my position with the Human Rights and Business Roundtable, it's a program that well predates me from starting in the 90s. And it is a setting for some of these large, especially extractive industry, gold, silver, oil and gas, to sit down with human rights activists and organizations and kind of build a solidarity space where especially in the 90s and early 2000s, that space didn't exist. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we have moved to a virtual setting. So we have foregone some of the intense privacy rules that we began the roundtable with, and will be returning to hopefully as soon as possible. And for the last 2 years, and probably for the foreseeable 2022 programs, we'll be hosting virtual panel sessions where we discuss various issues, different topics throughout the year. And our upcoming one will be on some of the strategic minerals. So that will be coming up this spring. We'll be looking at some of the extractive industries and some of the new extractive industries that are up and coming, like lithium and nickel, that are in much more demand than they ever were before. And some of the human rights activists and organizations that are making sure that those new players in the extractive industry game kind of catch up with some of the other extractive industry that has been on this human rights train now for quite a long time. So I've seen some people already chatting in the chat box, which is great. I would like to invite all of you to put questions in the chat. I will go ahead and use my prerogative as the moderator to start asking some questions. And I would love it if in the chat box you would note who you are. That would be great. And then who you would like to ask the question of, whether it is an individual or the whole panel, before asking your question. So just to start off, and this is for Jenny Vaughn, but also, if anyone else has some specific responses to this, I'd like to, anyone can join in. But what are some of the constraints that companies are currently facing in being proactive about peace?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's, it seems reasonable that companies should care about stability. Doing business, of course, requires this. So indeed, why aren't we seeing more action? I think there's been a few things that I've observed that I just want to touch on. One is that I do see that companies are still quite constrained by the economic system that they're operating in, meaning we still operate in a global economic system where the company's primary duty is to its shareholders. There's this view that the purpose of the company is to generate profit, not to solve social problems. So if we want to change that and change the incentives that companies are operating under, that's something to consider, as that leads to really short-term views and means that they're facing competing incentives in the actions that they take. Second issue, I do see particularly amongst large multinational corporations, which is the companies that BSR predominantly works with, that there is a real lack of understanding, first of all, about the local contexts in which companies work. The people who are concerned with and responsible for managing human rights risks are typically sitting way up here at the corporate level. But of course, the problems are where the company's business activity interfaces with the local context on the ground. And so the people who are on the ground who are dealing with conflict are not necessarily the ones who have knowledge about the company's human rights commitments. And neither at the corporate level nor at the ground level is there necessarily knowledge about how to respond in a conflict-sensitive way. So that gap between understanding the context and then understanding the company's impact on the context is a real barrier. And then one of the last things that I want to highlight here is companies don't necessarily recognize a responsibility to act proactively on the context. So this is a real major tenet, of course, of conflict sensitivity, this idea that nobody's neutral, that you need to know the context and your impact on the context in order to avoid exacerbating conflict. Many companies, however, are guided by what is essentially the Bible for business and human rights. That's called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs. And many companies interpret the UNGPs as being quite narrowly focused on preventing immediate infringements on people's rights. There's not necessarily the understanding that companies can impact people's rights via the pathway of the context. Operating on the context is seen as the role of the government, and companies have historically been very reluctant to step into a space where they don't necessarily feel like they have the right or the authority or the legal duty to act proactively. So those are some of the key constraints that I've seen blocking company action around peace and conflict.
Great. And I saw a lot of nodding coming from Jennifer and Lucy. Is there anything either of you would like to add?
Sure. Yeah. I think looking at this intersection between, again, this comes from my experience working with tech companies, which have a little bit of a different cultural and structural approach to this. So a lot of the work we've been doing is moving some of the conversation about technology and human rights away from the sort of original conversations there around privacy and freedom of expression, and helping to raise awareness about the role of technology in conflict. So that's one part of the work. But then the other is helping bridge the gap with conflict sensitivity and human rights. And a lot of technology companies, or at least the larger multinational companies, have really wonderful human rights teams in place, and they're all sort of focused on the UNGPs. And so when we go in and we start talking about, well, do you think about conflict sensitivity in your work? I mean, 5 years ago, I was getting blank stares of what is conflict sensitivity? We do UNGPs, like we do RUGI. That's what we do. And so it's been helping them find that connection. Sometimes that means using the language of human rights, but as we know, sometimes using the language of human rights can also inhibit our actions when it comes to being conflict sensitive and to taking positive action for peace. So when a human rights frame would make you think about specific rights holders as your main focus, a conflict sensitivity analysis takes a broader approach, and you're looking at communities impacted, you're looking at a regional analysis, and the context is very different. And so a lot of it is translating between conflict sensitivity and peace building. And this is just a part of conflict sensitivity of let's not make things worse. We haven't even gotten to the let's build peace yet. And putting those into a human rights framing so that you can help people start to be aware that when we say companies are conflict actors, that's not a negative, there's no negative connotation to that. It's just really an understanding of the role. Because like Jenny said, if a company says, we're not conflict actors, that's all about government, it's just really scary new territory for a lot of corporations who don't necessarily want to do bad things, but thinking about their company and the role of conflict is a really difficult leap to make. And so there's a lot of translation work. We do that. And I think that that's one of the inhibitions that we focus on, or that we've encountered in trying to bridge some of those gaps between the human rights internal capacity of a company and then the conflict sensitivity peace building part.
Emily, I could just add something to that maybe, because a lot of what both Jennifer and Jenny said rings a bell here in Congo. I think one of the things that I would definitely pick up on what Jennifer just mentioned around language and also speaking the language of business. So there we've had to work with some very trusted interlocutors. I think international peacebuilding organizations and national peacebuilding organizations have a role to play in building community confidence in private sector, because there is a lot of suspicion around that. And we do have that level of confidence, but we also have to work with interlocutors within the private sector who have that same confidence with the private sector and can help to approach them and explain to them why it's important that they, and how they can actually contribute to peace building and to peace opportunities. And I think it doesn't really work in their favor to not be conflict sensitive, because that's only going to attract more risk and therefore more cost, and it does affect your bottom line as well. So I think when you start to talk in business terms, people get it very easily, and they're also working in this same environment. We're all working in the same context, so it's not entirely alien. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that I think also we need to recognize that we're encouraging, if we're doing the kind of work that we're doing, sometimes we're trying to encourage business to play more of a role in what is an already very difficult environment for them. It's very risky from a security perspective, obviously, but also from an operations become incredibly complicated and expensive. In a lot of fragile states, the government doesn't have the frameworks necessary to create an environment for investment and for proper business development. Maybe there's not the financing, there's all sorts of different challenges that we see. And so I think, it's so important to have these discussions and to be really open and to understand what are the conditions and the constraints, and then try to work with those basically. So that's a little bit what I just wanted to add.
Thank you. That's great. So we've got a question here from Stacy Shamber, and she says to Jenny, and I think Lucy can also speak to this on the ground as well. What is your advice for local women peace builders and CSOs to approach businesses and the private sector to explore possible collaboration?
Yeah, great question. And hi, Stacy. So great to see your name pop up here. I think there's a couple of things I would say here. The first is that I have found that things I learned as core principles of peace building and local development do apply to the way that you work with companies, namely things like know the context, understand the different interests that the people you're engaging with might have, and build capacity to drive change. So meaning, in this case, build capacity inside the company. I think what peace builders should be thinking about is maybe 4 categories of things. So one of those is using language that companies will understand. So at the corporate level, as Jen was describing a moment ago, that's really about utilizing the business and human rights framework, because that's the way companies communicate about their impacts on people. I think at the local level, that's less important. It's probably more important just to be able to talk about impacts on people and how that impacts the business down the line. A second category of ways that companies, that local civil society and peace builders can help, it's really about filling those knowledge gaps, ensuring that people on the ground at these companies, as well as at the headquarters levels, that they understand the context, that they understand how their business activity is impacting the context. Again, the key message here is really helping companies understand how they impact people, how they impact human rights via that pathway of impacting the context. But critical to this is understanding who you're engaging. So I think how you speak and what messages you deliver really does have to do with the role of the person inside the company, thinking about how you can empower them to make change, understand the constraints they're facing, so that the information you provide enables them to make change internally. There's just one other kind of category of things that I want to raise here, and that's thinking through taking what I would call a constructive versus an adversarial approach. I would say right off the bat that there is a whole ecosystem of actors that are necessary to get business to behave in a way that supports peace, stability, and human rights. We need the activists who are creating pressure on companies. Those activists, when they're doing these actually quite effective public campaigns, their audience is really the CEOs. They're trying to get corporate leadership to change corporate priorities. if you're acting with people or you're interacting with people who are kind of the doers inside companies, you probably want to take a more constructive approach. So thinking about, again, partly this is about managing how you're perceived. So actually, for those of you who are doing a lot of conflict resolution, taking that interest-based negotiation approach, remembering that how you're perceived shapes the way your listener hears your message, that rule really applies here. I hear over and over from companies that they don't want to interact with critical stakeholders. This is a huge mistake, obviously, because those critical stakeholders are raising concerns that companies should be aware of in order to prevent egregious harms. But often the people on the ground at companies who are interacting, they don't really know how to handle those confrontational approaches, and they're not necessarily the decision makers. So engaging in a way that raises the concern and doesn't back down from that, but also seeks to understand what is the role of that company representative, what do they see as the barriers to making a change, and how can you provide them or somebody else at the company with the right information to change the way they're acting in a way that's doing harm. I think I will just stop there, and I'm sure my co-panelists will have some thoughts as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jenny. Can I jump in? Is that okay? I wanted to say that I agreed with everything that you just said, Jenny. It all makes a lot of sense to me. The only thing that I would add is that I think if we're talking about local women peacebuilders and CSOs, we need to be conscious that in a lot of conflict contexts, the societal dynamics and the gender dynamics are such that many women will not only not have the confidence to approach what they may perceive as being difficult stakeholders in private sector and not really understanding how to engage them. But also structurally, they may not be taken very seriously. Even within their community or their family, they may be asked what is it that they're trying to do. So there's also, the only thing that I would say is that there's also a kind of complementary piece to all of this, which is working on those gender dynamics and working with women to strengthen their confidence. We have a cross-border trade project, and almost all cross-border trade in Eastern DRC and Rwanda and Burundi is carried out by women. So we've also facilitated some discussions with microfinance institutions, for example, around how they could better adapt their products to women cross-border traders who don't have maybe a lot of guarantee upfront, or who are just starting in their business. And many of them are the only breadwinners in their families. They don't necessarily have a big network behind them who can be there to assure their bank loans and so on. That's at a really local, small scale, but I think it is important, an important sort of complement to a lot of what Jenny already said.
I saw there was a question in here about kind of getting business buy-in for prevention in particular. And I just wonder if I could jump in on that point as well, because I think that is, in my view, a really critical piece of what we want companies to do. For me, a lot of that getting buy-in for prevention is about tapping into companies' desire, their kind of natural conservatism with regard to risk and companies' desire to try to avoid risk in the first place. It really does take, of course, the conflict analysis. What is actually driving conflict in that particular location? And then how can company actions address those underlying drivers? And I see that, that prevention breaking up along a couple of common lines. If we go back to talking about technology, for example, and social media in particular, it's about social media platform companies understanding how speech on their platforms might be reinforcing particular narratives or fostering tensions, and how things are perceived differently during times of crisis. For just about any company that has an operational footprint on the ground, it's using a lot of those do no harm principles to think about how company resources are being used. Who's benefiting from subcontracts to suppliers? Who's benefiting from hiring? So thinking about how company operations might be reinforcing economic marginalization and grievances is important, and how company investment at the local level can actually counter some of that. And I suppose the incentive in theory for companies, although I'll be perfectly honest that it is all so big picture that I think we are still really needing to find the way to make the case to companies. But in theory, it's this recognition that a peaceful and stable environment is going to be good for business. In addition to enabling companies to do the right things in terms of respect for human rights.
Jenny, I really agree with you like 1,000%. You've said a whole bunch of things here which are absolutely spot on. A lot of the concern and what do you say, the good vibes come from above, and the board members and the companies want to see things happen in a peaceful way. And the worst thing that can possibly happen is conflict. Nothing hurts the bottom line. If you want to assume that all they care about is the bottom line, nothing hurts the bottom line like conflict. A peaceful economy is worth far, far more than one in conflict. There are people who can make money in conflict, no question. But for the big companies and for the multinationals, it's helpful to have a peaceful environment to work in. I would ask my colleagues here on the panel, one of the really interesting tensions that you see is when you have a very functional multinational company operating in a very dysfunctional state, and there is this pressure for the company to essentially take over the duties of the state, to run the hospitals, to fix the roads, to get the power running and things like that, which is great. And the companies are happy to do that. Generally, it's a small fraction of their profits. But is that what they should be doing? And are they essentially becoming de facto governments? Is that what we want to see as NGOs?
Jennifer, I saw you had was something to bring in earlier. I want to make sure that you didn't get your comment didn't get lost.
Oh, thanks. It was just a comment to build on some of the interventions that Jenny was discussing in terms of how we can communicate between peace builders and companies. And it just a reminder that we also need to think about timelines are very, very different. Timelines for people on the ground who are experiencing conflict, it's like all of this needed to happen yesterday, and the concern and the urgency is imminent. With corporations, they might be 3 or 4 years talking about maybe what they should be doing, thinking about having a policy, and maybe we should think about in Q4 starting this kind of engagement program. And so that in itself can just cause a complete breakdown of communications and a lot of frustration and more adversary types of engagement interaction, because peace builders and human rights activists on the ground, I think these people just do not actually care what's happening, and people are dying. And I think, from the corporate perspective, especially when you're talking about huge multinational companies, people, the doers, so to speak, are very concerned, but they're trying to move a mountain to action, and that in itself takes a lot of time. So, not asking peace builders and human rights activists to wait and be complacent with that, but to just understand a little bit what those constraints are, and then asking companies to say, okay, how can we streamline these processes and raise that awareness and have people ready to act when they need to be acting, and let's get out of reaction mode and start to prevent and address these things and understand what we can do before the proverbial shit hits the fan.
Emily, can I come in on just on Doug's question, if that's okay, because it feels very relevant for where I'm sat right now. Absolutely, Doug. And actually, I think one of the things that both private sector, but also NGOs, I mean, a lot of us risk stepping into a state space, right? And that is the case here in Eastern DRC, where we're working with a state that is pretty patchy, let's say, in its service delivery. And I think, so what I would say there is that like a peace building approach that's open to engaging with all actors. And I would really build on what Jenny was saying before, like we really have to have strong conflict analysis. And that's important for us as peace builders to really understand who we're engaging with, how to engage with them, if they're the right actor to engage with, because not everybody has the best interests at heart. But that analysis is important for everybody, actually, and it's an entry point for working with private sector. It's also an entry point for working with the government. So what I think, if you have a synergy where you can bring together all of these actors and explain to them how if we all work together, we can all benefit. And I'll just give you a really quick example from the mining project that we're working on. In order to trade gold in Eastern DRC, you have to pay something around 26 different types of tax. It's insane and does not work. And the government does accept this as well, but also is facing considerable constraints on its own side. It needs to make revenue. And so what we're trying to do is bring all of these different actors together to explain. I mean, the state is losing out if private sector decides to smuggle gold out of the country, which is what happens around, I think there's figures are somewhere between 80 and 90% of gold that gets smuggled out. So the state is losing out on a huge amount of revenue there. It's not helping communities who are living and working in these mine sites. There's a lot of violence that's going on and that's linked to that criminal activity. And it's not helping the private sector either. They're under a lot of threat. And they still have to pay a lot of tax informally. So what we try to do is bring everybody together and we work on interests. What is the win-win scenario here for the government, for the private sector, for communities, for CSOs, and have a very clear debate about the roles of each of those actors so that you don't have exactly what you were describing, Doug, where you have a private sector actor that is essentially functioning, carrying out state function, which also doesn't work. So yeah, I think it's a super pertinent question for where I'm sat. Thank you.
I just want to reinforce that point as well, that I think we're barking up the wrong tree collectively if we are talking to companies about philanthropy or charitable contributions. That's not to sideline the important role that corporate donations could play, but I feel like the name of the game is really about getting business to operate differently. And this is actually consistent with the business and human rights framework laid out by the UNGPs, because it requires that efforts to prevent and mitigate harm to people, human rights impacts, are integrated into the way that companies operate. So that's what we should really be doing, is helping companies understand that context, understand how their various operations could do harm or counter conflict drivers, and then to make decisions accordingly.
So I want to kind of build on that a little bit. And one of the things that we've been talking about is kind of business in a fairly homogeneous sense. And I think that this is especially relevant to some of the stuff that Lucy was just touching on with gold and the taxes, and Jennifer's work with technology. Is what are some of these best practices across different fields, and are they varied, right? Do we need a different set of rules and best practices for technology company versus extractive industry versus some of the other industries that we're working with in this, umbrella of business and human rights?
I guess I'll kick off just real short. I think every business has its own issues that it has to deal with, especially I think the tech ones have some unique ones. But when we put together the code of conduct for ISOA, it's a 2-page document, and it applies to logistics companies, landmine removal companies, medical companies, and it's basically just, these are the points that everybody should follow. If you look at the voluntary principles on security and human rights, much more detailed, much more focused. Same thing for the International Code of Conduct for private security providers. Again, much more detailed and things like that. But there are some basic points that every company can simply follow. But yeah, I think I'll let the others talk more. They know more about that than I do.
Thanks, Doug. Just to build off of that, I think if we get back to first principles, they're the same. Understand your context, understand your role, and understand how your business decisions impact the conflict, for better, for worse. I think for different industries, that can be understanding that can be quite complex. When we talk about the technology industry, are we talking about artificial intelligence? Are we talking about like what kind of technology? Social media. Some companies operate in all of those spaces. And so finding your way within those companies to help the right decision makers understand that context can be quite difficult. And then there's the core principle of understanding your audience and being able to communicate these differences. So that's where sometimes we find ourselves in the role of perpetuating the myth that the tech industry is very unique and has, I mean, it is unique and it does have its own set of questions, interests, and complexities, but it is not exceptional in the sense that the role of business and human rights and peace building is all that different, but it thinks it is in many ways. And so when we're communicating with tech companies in the industries, a lot of times we have to translate and build on that culture within Silicon Valley, within tech companies of, okay, this is a really new, different thing. This touches different people in their lives. We want to bring people together, but sometimes that backfires and it can cause these conflicts. So what do we do about it? And understanding that software engineers have a different frame of reference for their work. Nobody wants to go in and design evil software necessarily, but we have to be able to speak to our audience and to translate a lot of this stuff into how people can understand their day-to-day roles and it impacts human rights. So again, the basic principles, there's 2-page documents, you really boil it down, it's not that different. But when you get into the complexities of applying that within an industry, I think there is a huge level of difference. And each industry will have its uniqueness.
For those kinds of companies that have an operational footprint on the ground, so distinct from companies that might have a presence, but not necessarily a geographic presence, the other, I think, 3 best practices that I've increasingly been really zeroed in on that I just want to highlight here. One is that I kind of recently arrived at the conclusion that if there is a single silver bullet, dare I say, for human rights, for peace and business, it's stakeholder engagement. So this is like pretty foundational, pretty basic, and it's so basic that a lot of people just gloss over it. But I think I raised earlier the points that companies often don't want to listen to critical voices. And in fact, having people in the local context who can flag you when there's a concern so that you can take action, whether that's your company's doing some kind of harm that could be reputationally damaging, or the conflict is about to intensify, and so you need to get your staff out. All of those things are really critical. So having the mechanisms for ongoing, regular stakeholder engagement with a broad range of actors is absolutely critical. And again, many of the local actors on the ground inside companies, they won't necessarily know how to engage with civil society in an effective way. That really puts the onus on civil society and peace builders to approach in a constructive way with all of kind of the principles that we've been discussing here. Second best practice, somewhat related, but it's building on this idea of know the context. It's having monitoring mechanisms in place to track changes in the context. What characterizes, of course, a conflict context is that it can be very rapidly changing. And to outsiders, which many companies are staffed with outsiders, not from that place, it can be very opaque, trying to predict how that context will evolve. So this is where the stakeholder engagement feeds back in, having those mechanisms to track evolutions in the context, and then ensuring that you're able to contingency plan, scenario plan, and have plans in place for what to do under different crisis scenarios. Another key thing that companies on the ground should be doing, and probably would benefit from that process being fed into by local stakeholders. And then the last thing that I think is a really important best practice, not sure how civil society helps with this, but one of the things that I've observed is that there's often a very poor relationship inside companies between the market level teams, the country level teams, the local level teams, and the corporate level teams. And I've reflected that the NGO community has been thinking about this for many, many years. There are models for how international expat HQ-based staff should partner with staff who are from the country that they are working in. And so there's some lessons to be learned that I would like us to find a way to transfer to the corporate world for what is the role of the corporate level and the local level? What is the appropriate way for those two levels to partner in order to be effective? Because they can't really solve the problem if they're working in isolation. They are each bringing quite unique sets of skills. So maybe the way that civil society and peace builders help with that is knowing, again, you're going to approach the corporate level with one set of messages and the local level with another set of messages. And maybe there's a way to do some bridge building internally inside companies through the way that you engage with those companies.
I love that. Thank you so much, Jenny. I love that the first order of business is like talk to people. It always blows my mind how it seems so simple to a lot of people who are trained in the peace building area, but to have to explain that sometimes is always wild. So we have a few good questions coming in through the chat. I want to start with Nazneen Khan, who is asking about some of these peace building and business practices in context where they are not at peace. So in businesses functioning in volatile environments. So how do you talk to businesses about peace building when it might be more along the lines of peacekeeping?
I can jump in there. Once again, feels very relevant. No, absolutely. I think, you know what, it's interesting because when you first, in this kind of a context, when you first approach companies to talk about business for peace or conflict sensitive approaches, in such an environment as this one, if they have managed to stay afloat as a business up until today, they have their ways of managing the context, and that we might not be 100% on board with a lot of the tactics and strategies that they use, but that's the way that they have managed their operations. And it's such a fragile system, they're not prepared to change those overnight. But it's interesting because first of all, we kind of work, I would say, on push and pull factors. So there have been instances where we've developed investor guides. We did that in Uganda, for example, which was a tool that was made readily available. We did a little bit of a launch around it and so on, but it became a tool that we proposed. And we went to investors and we worked at trade fairs and so on and did a little bit of work around that. And people slowly took it up and thought, oh, this is interesting. I'd never really thought about these sorts of concepts. On the other hand, you can also come in when you know that a business is hurting, to put it very bluntly. So we do in all of our conflict monitoring, when we're keeping an ear out for that sort of stuff. And we know that there will be, at some point, if a business is not operating in a conflict sensitive way, there will be a repercussion somewhere. And so we can also step in at that point. And I think it's when they're most open to listening to you, you have a solution to offer them. And that's, so I think I would also just say, I think it may build a little bit on maybe what Jennifer was saying earlier. Sometimes you have to know your audience, and you have to wait for a moment when they're most likely to hear and listen to your message. The other thing that I would say is that in a lot of volatile contexts, this maybe touches on a little bit what Jenny was saying. It's hard to do some of that scenario planning and that longer term planning, which we think is so important. I actually think that that's one of the most conflict sensitive things you can do, is have a longer term plan, because it's shorter term decisions that tend to lead to mistakes and conflict insensitive practice. But it's hard to do that in a volatile context. So your conflict analysis is going to help, but also identifying opportunities, and opportunities where businesses themselves have the influence to change something. They don't have to wait for anybody else to do anything. So a lot of the businesses in Eastern DRC, they wear multiple hats, and they have a lot of influence politically and within certain groups within society. And if businesses come together in a coalition for good, they can also open up roads, which will open up enormous opportunities and markets, so it benefits the businesses as well. Or they can come together to try to address a particular insecurity in a particular region, which is also impacting business and impacting opportunity. So I think if you can use this kind of language, it's amazing how quickly you can get people on board, even in the most volatile contexts.
In actual conflicts, I think there's a sort of two kinds of companies, as I mentioned right at the beginning. If you're hiring a company to support a peacekeeping operation, then essentially you control the company. You get to tell them if they have to wear pink paisley pajamas when they do their job. They will either agree to that or not agree to it, but that's your choice, and the clients have a lot of control. But if we say take Mozambique as an example, I think it's a really, really interesting example. It's a very complex conflict going on. You have a massive amount of natural gas there. So there's a bunch of large companies that are trying to go in and ancillary companies that are trying to go in to do work there. And you have these terrorist attacks going on. Now, how is the behavior of the companies? What is happening? It's really, really interesting to see how the companies operate. I mean, I think for the most part, they're trying to do the right thing, but you have a case where their expat employees are being evacuated out first, as opposed to their local employees, or they're being evacuated differently. And then there's this whole dynamic of whether the local employees are actually locals or they're from another part of Mozambique, so it doesn't even count. There's all sorts of things going on, and it's really interesting to see how the companies are handling it. And I think for the most part, they're trying to do the right thing, but it's important to watch this. And I think it's a real good opportunity for us to take a look and see what's behind the company, but not just the companies. I think the other super interesting thing, and once a conflict starts, just from an academic perspective here, what do the NGOs do? Do they evacuate their expats and leave their other people behind? Are they actually doing the right thing? And I think one of the things that was very frustrating to me when we started our own code of conduct and we had all these NGOs coming in and giving us, we want companies to do this, that, and the other thing. Did the NGOs do that? Were the NGOs hiring security companies that followed a code of conduct, that were properly vetted, or were they hiring thugs or us to do their own security? And unfortunately, that's normally what they did. You hire the guy who's cousin with your door guard or something like that, and then boom, you have your security company. But it applies to everybody. And I think there's a lot of examples that pop up when something bad happens, like we see in Mozambique, and it's really, really interesting.
I'll just chime in to add that I think these examples of crisis end up being one of the best arguments for companies to take proactive action in other cases. What I've seen, I'm thinking specifically of the recent coup in Myanmar, is that weirdly, a lot of those companies were surprised. They were surprised by, the attacks on the Rohingya in Rakhine State. This was not a surprise necessarily to people who had been tracking the context closely, but many of those companies were caught on the back foot. So there are some specific things that companies might be able to immediately do. But what we're really trying to do in the work we do with companies, because many of them have a footprint in other places that could blow up in the future, it is about saying, okay, where are your places that are high risk? What kind of contingency planning do you need to do in advance there? What kind of plans should you have to keep your staff, whether they're local or expat, safe, and so on? So I think really trying to get out of this reactive mode. Yes, we want to help companies deal with crises when a crisis does occur, but I'm a lot more interested, I think, in being preventative and in taking that example of a crisis to say, here's what you could put in place next time so that you're not caught off guard. And then kind of finding yourself in these human rights related scandals in the media because you didn't have a proper plan in place.
Well, and just to piggyback off of that and something that Lucy was saying as well in terms of bringing companies together, I think when we're talking about multinational companies, there's some more disconnect there in terms of, coming together with your competitors. But when you're talking about volatile, quickly changing situations, you need to be able to find common ground. And this is where it comes back to streamlining and creating more efficiencies and understanding prediction, understanding what works, reducing stakeholder fatigue. If all the multinational tech companies are interviewing and doing stakeholder engagement with local groups, for example, in Ethiopia, let's try and reduce the burden on those groups and try and streamline that process so we can collect the same learnings, learn from each other, share data. Nothing that would, violate any non-compete clauses or violate, any kind of business interest, but there's a lot that we can be learned when we come together as multinational companies in these very volatile, quickly moving situations that can help us move more quickly, and also through collective action bring our leverage together to try and effect more positive change.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think anyone who has done, and speaking again as an academic, anyone who's done anthropology or, ethnographic research sees that that interview fatigue in their populations, and they're like, am I the fourth white person to ask you this? So it is definitely an important part of the conversation. And so I want to build. I think we touched on Ted Perlmutter's question a little bit, and Jenny, you responded, but I'd like to build on it a little bit and ask about businesses. And Doug, this your phrase kind of took this off in my mind is, what about businesses that aren't necessarily there for good, right? Like their product is part of the problem. So in Myanmar, Facebook itself, the actual product that they were creating, the algorithm and the space of intense freedom of expression was the problem, right? So what about in beyond some of these tech companies, some countries that, whether it is mining or it is, I don't know, building guns or missiles, what is it? What do we do when the business is not necessarily functioning for the common good?
Well, I'll just drop it in with a reflection. I think there are some companies that I would say are not there for the common good. So I would personally point out, arms manufacturers, for example. Tobacco companies get a lot of criticism. A lot of other companies, I actually think it's murkier. So let's take social media. What we do hear from the range of external stakeholders that we've spoken with about social media in conflict-affected contexts is that their perspective on whether public security and safety or freedom of expression, it's really conditioned by which side of the conflict they sit on. Some people would prioritize freedom of expression. They think it's really important that narratives about government actions get out, for example, whereas others will say, no, we should be clamping down more on freedom of expression during times of conflict because the risk of inflaming tensions and inciting offline harm are that much higher. Do I have a solution for this? Not really, but I think a lot of the solution has to do not with the one size fits all, but with companies in particular geographical locations engaging with those local stakeholders and ensuring that they have policies that are clear to everyone and that they're consistently enforcing those. The other murky situation that I wanted to raise, this is something that I've been working on a lot lately. It is actually, in fact, this question of mining companies, and particularly those mining companies extracting minerals necessary for a clean energy transition. It appears to be a trade-off. Do we support mining or do we support clean energy? You can't have, how do you support a clean energy transition whilst avoiding some of the negative impacts of mining? I think that's the real question. So it's not as simple as mining is always negative. It's, in my view, more a matter of how do we ensure access to those critical minerals in a way that doesn't do harm and doesn't do disproportionate harm to groups that are marginalized or have a history of this exploitative relationship by powerful actors. So I think it's often very complex and murky. And I think civil society actually, in order to be effective in engaging companies, should be well aware of the trade-offs, because I don't think we're going to make progress if we say, no, companies must act like this. We need to help companies think through the trade-offs. And we as a global society have to be able to have a conversation about What cost are we willing to pay for the clean energy transition, for example?
Yes, I bring to mind the same smartphones that helped, organize the Arab Spring were built, using coltan that had to be mined, through slavery and child labor. So, there is no, nice clean answer to some of these questions. Jennifer, do you want to come in on that? Oh, Lucy, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I'll just add something really quick because I really like what Jenny said. I feel like she's been very articulate in the way that she captured that. I guess it's that, right? I mean, like for example, in Eastern DRC, there's very little in the way of an economy here. There are a lot of minerals. So, it's very challenging. And as long as you don't have proper regulation around those minerals, or you have regulation that is that does not favor conflict-sensitive development and community development around mine sites, for example, that then you'll just be encouraging illicit mining, and everybody will lose out, actually. So if you can find a win-win solution, then I think that is the way forward. And for example, the tax revenues that I made reference to before, those, according to the new mining code in DRC, a certain portion of that revenue should come back to the territorial level and should be reinvested in community development projects, which I don't know if they could ever really mitigate the negative impacts that you were making reference to. I doubt that they will ever mitigate all of those negative impacts. But if we can find a way where mining is safe and secure for the people who are doing it, and they see the benefits of it themselves, and that gets reinvested in their communities, then that's already something that doesn't exist right now, unfortunately, for most people in Eastern DRC.
Doug, did you want to come in on that?
I wanted to answer Stacey Schomburg's question here.
Okay, yeah, sure. 1 second. Let me just see if Jennifer has a reaction to that conversation, kind of on the tech side of things. This balance.
Yeah, well, you said balance. I think that's really the crucial word here, and I think that makes that's the really difficult part that we have as practitioners, and also the companies, of course, internally in terms of making their own decisions. But when you see through one action, again, taking Jenny's example and transitioning it to a different one, so protecting a human right in a certain conflict situation might exacerbate the conflict if you want a company to take that strict human rights lens. Whereas on the other hand, if a company wants to remain a neutral actor and not exacerbate the conflict, it might mean withholding or postponing or making a different decision on a certain human rights impact that they're linked to. And so it's never that clear, black and white. And we just have to think about how we can come together to understand the larger context and find that balance and be proportionate. But it's never going to be, I don't think we can all win all the time. And that's, I know, really difficult for activists and advocates to be able to take on board and to feel like we're having an impact when we don't necessarily see everything coming out the way that we had hoped to, and we don't understand the complexity of the other position.
Yes, I absolutely agree. It can feel like a Sisyphusian project sometimes, because you win some and conversely, you have to lose some. So, Doug took us a little bit towards Stacey's question, and it takes us a little bit into a new field in this conversation, which is looking at some of the funding peculiarities in the relationship between business and human rights organizations, and some of the occasionally sticky points that can happen when a for-profit business funds good work for a variety of their own reasons, right? Doug, do you want to get us started off on that topic?
Sure. Jenny brought up the point that a peaceful environment is much more profitable than one in conflict. And there's a fantastic example of this. If you go back to the Mozambique again, but many years ago, when they were having their civil war. And there were power lines that were going from Cabor Bassa Dam to South Africa that had to be protected. And so a private security company was paid to do security for the power lines. They set up, they brought in Gurkha security guards, and these guys set up little security posts along the power lines to protect them. And the Mozambican population clustered around these little security points because that's where the security was. And it became this huge sort of economic boom for Mozambique in the middle of the Civil War. But taking this a step further, there was an industrialist called Tiny Rowland, and a guy named Alex Vines has written on this. He was with Human Rights Watch. I think he may still be with them for years. Tiny Rowland was an industrialist who wanted to actually do agricultural work in Mozambique in the middle of a war. But obviously that's really expensive. And so he thought, maybe if I end the war, it'll be profitable. So he pulls out his billfold, and he basically spends millions of dollars paying one side off and the other to come to peace talks and do agreements. He got the various embassies involved. And ultimately, they were the ones who brokered the peace that ended the war in Mozambique. It cost Tiny Rowland a lot more than he was ever going to make in the agricultural thing. I'm not sure that's the way we ideally want to end wars, but it worked. And in fact, I think there is an incentive for companies to want to support ending conflicts. Perhaps they could do it a bit more cost effectively than Tiny Rowland did, but I think there is that interest of doing it. Tiny probably got beyond the let's do it for the profit to let's do it for the right reasons. But I think companies would do it even just for the profit margin. It makes sense for them to help contribute to it if they know how to do it, and if they are given some sort of avenue where they know it can work.
I think there's a little bit of a false division I sometimes feel in the business and human rights community over whether we should be asking companies to respect human rights because it's the right thing to do, or if we should be making the business case. My own bias is we should make the argument that's going to get companies to take action. I don't think we can divorce profitability and financial incentives from the incentives companies feel to act. So I find myself increasingly interested in the argument that yes, it's the right thing for companies to do, but it is also better for business for companies to be actively engaged in addressing a range of social issues that I would put under that peace building heading, whether it's looking at the rise of far right extremism in the US and Europe, of other kinds of extremism in other parts of the world, authoritarianism, etc. There was a recent talk that Microsoft's CEO gave recently, where he basically said that the purpose of a corporation is to find profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. It's a lot of P's in there. And I really like that, because that's, at the end of the day, the leadership teams at companies that we are trying to convince to take action, they are in it to run a successful business. So we have to be able to make the link for how taking proactive action on that wider context is important to achieving that goal of running a successful business. Even if we are, I think, trying to change the narrative and shift the view that maybe the purpose of a company is not just to generate profits for shareholders, but to really leverage the power of capitalism to solve some of the very real problems that we're all facing.
Someone else want to come in on that, or would you like to move on? Lucy, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, no, it's just reminded me of something that I think Jennifer said earlier. Jennifer, there was at some point you mentioned the word culture, like organizational culture, way back, maybe 20 minutes ago or 30 minutes ago. And it's just circled back to me, because I think we can't underestimate that. And I think if there are the right leaders at the top of the organization, I think that was one of Jenny's points earlier. And if you're setting an organizational culture that encourages reflection and analysis, and it encourages out of the box thinking, like the example that Doug just gave, I feel like that's one of the most important things that businesses can do. And once you manage to shift that organizational change, which is that's a huge thing to achieve, I feel like they look at everything in a different way, and things become opportunities, and there aren't doors that close, there are doors that open. So I just it just came back to me what Jennifer and Jenny had mentioned earlier.
I think one of the interesting stories that Doug's story brought up is when the city of Houston was desegregating. And they are one of the only large cities that had no violence during the desegregation process. During that, like the weekend of transition where they went from, they desegregated the center of the city. And it was because the white businesses and the black businesses and the white churches and the black churches all sat down and they were like, this is not good for business. And they're like, if you talk to your people, we'll talk to our people, and everyone will stay off the streets, keep it together, no alcohol that weekend, and we will get through this transition moment together for economic reasons. And a lot of other cities around the United States were under heavy damage after these transition periods, and Houston sailed through it, and absolutely not trying to whitewash over the amount of violence that did happen during the desegregation process overall, but during some of those specific transition periods, the Houston business community came together as a whole and knew that they could influence the people of the community to not seek violent solutions to this transition. So I found that's a really interesting story that Doug's Mozambique moment brought up for me, and I think it really speaks to the opportunity that we have, not just as peace builders, but as people who also participate in capitalism and participate in all of these business structures. And that was one of the things that I was kind of hoping to get at a little bit with Stacey's question is, we are also participating in this, not just as peace builders, but as consumers. So where do we stand on some of these issues of how businesses spend our money, right? And I can think of a few examples domestically here. Chick-fil-A is always under fire for how they choose to spend their philanthropy. Same with the MyPillow guy, right? Like he chose to speak at the Trump White House, and that had business repercussions. So I think it's really interesting to kind of bring in as we're wrapping up this conversation, not just the business ethics side of it, but also our participation as consumers, and this idea of how businesses spend their money for good, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and one thing I'll jump in and emphasize there is that I think the way that companies spend their influence, so maybe it's their money on philanthropic initiatives or lobbying or efforts like that, that is within the business and human rights field coming under increased scrutiny. I think it's, finally really being formally recognized and often now publicly discussed over the last couple of years that this is a key avenue where businesses can either do good or do harm. What has been found in bringing some of these lobbying or corporate donation activities to light is that these activities are often at odds with a company's stated human rights commitments or what they may be working toward, through other functions. So my own view is that we're at a point where increased attention does need to be brought to that hypocrisy, so that companies are under increased pressure to ensure an alignment between their human rights commitments and the way that all of their different functions, their legal team, their corporate and government affairs team, their operational teams are operating. And there's not necessarily that alignment at this stage. The challenge, of course, is that if I just take the United States as an example, increasingly polarized political environment, most national brands have, customers that span the political spectrum. It's increasingly difficult for a company to take a public stand on something without pissing off one or the other group of customers. So that is a challenge to be aware of that companies are navigating. Some advocates and some companies are trying to get around that bipartisanship by talking about the importance of democracy or the importance of press freedom. So things that in theory we ought as Americans to all be able to agree on. But it is, I think many CEOs really feel like it's increasingly a minefield to get active in at a time when, there's actually greater expectation. And certainly, we want to see companies in a way playing a more proactive role in terms of how they wield their influence.
I would support that largely. I think too often, there are some companies that base their whole model, like Ben and Jerry's, on having a particular, political perspective. But I think personally, and I work with the private sector a lot, 99 times out of 100, they're going to do the right thing. They actually believe this stuff and they actually understand they benefit from freedom and democracy and so on. But we shouldn't turn over our moral political decisions to the market. Yes, they're for-profit industries. That's kind of what their bottom line is. They may do the right thing, and you hope they will, and I think in most cases they will. But assuming they will, or relying on them to do the right thing, is a mistake.
I think that is a great place for us to kind of stop with the question and answer session. And we have just about 4 minutes left, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to make some closing remarks. Give yourself, just a minute or two just to wrap up some final thoughts on the subject matter. And if you have a LinkedIn or a website that you want to drop in the chat, I have seen a lot of those happening, so do please feel free to share. Lucy, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, Emily, and I really appreciate that we've had the chance to share a few examples from here in Eastern DRC, but it's also really interesting to put that into context with what we've heard from some of the people in the room as well, some of great questions coming through, and also from other fellow panelists. I guess I'm just really encouraged and buoyed by the fact that we're all trying to make this synergy work between business actors, peace builders, governments, civil society. And I think we've heard some great examples this evening of how that can work in a reliable, conflict-sensitive way, and that can actually contribute in a significant way to building peace and stability long term. So thank you. This has really encouraged me.
Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to echo what Doug eloquently closed with. I think that this panel has really highlighted that there is a lot of opportunity. There's so much opportunity to harness the power of business, and that broadly speaking, people want to do the right thing, even if they have competing interests, between shareholders and creating profit and also doing the right thing on the ground. But we also need to understand that there are certain limits to that conversation, that we shouldn't be putting so much reliance on business and counting on them always to do the right thing. Even people who are not necessarily evil don't want to get involved, and they don't want to jump into complex situations. And Ben and Jerry's reminds me of this. They took a real stand, for example, on their business in Palestine, and that has put them at the center of a whole mess of politics, of media, and that's also, had a chilling effect on other companies who are doing business in that region and how they might also make certain decisions. So I think it gets back to, we're doing this work, it's a really important work, but we should also remember that really solid legislation and regulation is also a really critical piece of this, and to the extent that we can also be working on that in parallel to help drive some of these conversations forward shouldn't be overlooked.
Doug, wrap up. comments?
Sure. I'm probably more, I mean, I come from a background, I'm more proactive in getting the private sector involved in peacekeeping and stability operations and ending conflicts. And I would think I would go further than most people in doing that. For example, during the Darfur conflict, we suggested that why don't we have one company in charge of a refugee camp or IDP camp, and just basically handle all the healthcare, all the security, and get paid basically on how many people are alive every month, and just put the incentives in the right place, and you bring a lot of efficiencies and a lot of security, a lot of really good things. I'm not sure that other people want to do it that way, but I think it's probably, we need to think outside the box on some of these things and make it work. Security, the same thing. It's perfectly okay for an oil company to hire a security company to do their security, but to hire the security company to protect their employees in the village next to the oil company, oh my God, that's mercenaries. No, I think there's a lot of things we can do to point industry in the right direction, to allow the industry to help end conflicts. How that's done exactly, and to make sure that it doesn't do things the wrong way, we got to figure that out. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm looking forward to actually Jenny's comments, because she's been right on the money on this stuff.
Jenny, last word.
Well, thanks so much, first of all, to my co-panelists and those of you in the virtual room. This has been a really interesting conversation for me. I think I want to close just emphasizing the importance of collaboration. Businesses really need input from civil society and need your guidance in terms of understanding the context and understanding how business can effectively collaborate with you. So I would just really encourage you all to think in your own work about how you can engage business, and would love to keep the conversation going about how to do that. Thank you so much.
Just want to say thank you to all of our panelists one more time. I think this was a really rich discussion, and I'm so thankful to our audience members who joined the conversation from the chat box, and really brought some varied and unique questions to the conversation. So without any further ado, it is Friday afternoon, and if you're in the DC area, it is already snowing. So wishing everyone a wonderful weekend, and please do stay in touch.